very quickly, I want to welcome you all to the third installment of the Responsible Conduct of Research series. And we have a wonderful presenter today, and it is Dr. Stanely Halvorsen. And I'm going to turn it over to him in a moment. I just want to tell you that we appreciate you attending this series. And I also would like to tell you that I'm going to be placing the survey in the chat at some time, so please make sure you get to that if you can. I'll also be sending you an email form, and I'll also be posting the slides towards the end of the presentation in a PDF form. Finally, if you have questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat or unmute and ask. Either way works perfectly fine for us. And if you write them into the chat, then I'm going to be just presenting them to Dr. Halvorsen at a nice break. So perhaps between slides. Finally, there's going to be some polls you can participate in. So once you do get to the polls, Dr. Halvorsen will tell me when to launch them. And then please participate in the polls because that will increase the engagement factor and get you more immersed into the learning. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Halvorsen. Thank you very much for coming. And Dr. Halvorsen, thank you very much for presenting.
Okay. All right, now welcome everybody. All right, so what we're going to talk about today are the use of animals in research, and it says ethical use of animals, and that will be part of it. But the emphasis is really going to be on how we use animals in research and the regulations that we follow, and kind of why we have regulations that actually kind of force us to use animals in an ethical way. And so we're going to spend a little time just kind of talking about how our institution and most institutions will regulate animal work and what the basis of that is and why we're doing it that way. Now, I do have some background in this area. I was the IACUC chair here at UB for about four or 5 years, a while back now, and the IACUC is the committee that oversees animal work on the campus, and we're going to talk about that in some detail. Following that, I was the institutional official here at UB that oversees all animal and human studies in terms of following all of these regulations. And so I was the institutional official here up until last fall. And so I no longer have that role. So I'm free of that burden, but I should be able to help with what the basis of it and how we operate here and why we operate these things here. Okay, so our objectives are really just to understand, why we use animals a little bit. It's not going to be a big discussion about the ethics of using animals. It's that we do it, and we're going to talk a little bit about the resources there are, where the regulations come from, and how you can find resources if you want them. We're going to talk about the IACUC, the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. So that's the committee. Every institution that does animal work is going to have something called something similar to this, and they're the ones that have oversight. And so we're going to talk about what they are, where they get where they get that responsibility, and what their responsibility is. We'll talk a little bit about the NIH in terms of funding animal research, and really all federal agencies in terms of what their policies basically are. All right, let's see, what else do we have? I'm going to talk about where these regulations come from, that the National Institute of Health and the other regulatory agencies, where that comes from. I'm going to talk about how the IACUC is here. We often think about the IACUC as being responsible for regulating research, but really their role is to support animal research. And they support animal research by making sure that we follow the regulations and that we do our work ethically. And they help researchers to do that. And so we want to emphasize that the IACUC is here to help you, and you want to use them as a resource. Okay. The way we get approval, or the way an investigator gets approval, is by submitting a research protocol to the IACUC, and that describes all of what they're going to do. And so we'll talk about the essential elements that have to go into that research protocol, and how the IACUC looks at it and reviews it. All right, so here's my short spiel on using animals in research. And basically, we do that because we have to. If you want to do biomedical science here in the US, and you want to get funding from the NIH, or you want to get something approved by the FDA, they say before you do anything in humans, you must do it in animals first. You must test it first. Now, this has been an absolute rule for a number of years. Animal research first, and then go into humans. There is recently maybe a little bit of wiggle room where some distinctly human kinds of treatments may not require an animal study first. But so far, those are very rare, and they're going to want to make sure that whatever you're planning to do has credibility by testing it in animals first. Credibility and safety issues. Okay. All right, now we're going to talk about the role here of the IACUCs in terms of animal studies. And actually, next week, you're going to have the session on the IRB, or the Institutional Review Board, and they oversee and approve all human studies. But we're going to make just a little bit of comparison here before we get into that. All right, so human subject research, animal subject research. There are federal guidelines that regulate how we do these things. On the human subject side, the agency is the Office of Human Research Protections, or OHARP. On the animal side, we have a number of regulatory agencies that have some overlap even, but most of it is going to be from the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare, or the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And we'll talk about where these come from. So this is what at the federal level, or the national level. At the institutional level, we have committees that make sure that these regulations are followed, and may even set policy within institutions. So we have our IRB for human research, and we have our IACUCs for animal. And they have a similar kind of responsibility. They must approve all human work or all animal work, and they set policy within their institutions. Now, there are also outside accreditation bodies, and most major research institutions are going to be accredited by one of these bodies. So for human research, it's called AHARP. And this is the I always get this one, Association for Accreditation of Human Research Protections Programs. And so they're going to come in and basically review our program. And again, you'll hear about this next week from Rich Corrales. But they're going to come in every several years and look through all of our human research operations, make suggestions, and then provide an accreditation saying that we meet their standards. On the animal side, it's ALAC, and this is the Association for the Assessment of Lab Animal Care. And this is an international body. And what they're going to do also is they're going to come in every 3 years, and they're going to look at every aspect of our animal research program. They're going to review some of the tens of dozens of animal protocols that we have, and make sure that they're written and approved in ways that meet all of these federal guidelines, as well as best practice. They are going to talk with caregivers, animal caregivers. They're going to talk with the responsible individuals. And they're going to look and inspect every inch of every animal room in our LAFs and make sure that they all are up to standards. And they may even go out and talk to individual researchers and ask them about the program. Ask some of your students about the program. What do they do? How do they do it? Make sure that everyone knows what they're doing in terms of animal care. And so this accreditation is important for us. It tells the rest of the nation that we are a fully accredited institution and that we follow all of the best practices in terms of our animal research. This last one is consent. Excuse me. And this one is one where we have a big difference between humans and animal research, and that is informed consent is absolutely essential for human research, and the subjects must be fully informed of what that study is, and they must agree. They agree to enter the study, and they also have the option of removing themselves from the study at any point that they no longer want to participate. Well, we don't have that for animals. Animals don't consent. And so that's one of the reasons why we have to have some kind of protection system in place as a surrogate for that consent for the animals. And that's where the excuse me, the federal government has stepped in and established these principles. And so that's what we're trying to establish with these oversight bodies, is that we are acting in the best interest as we can to provide that consent. So animals don't have any legal rights. Humans do. And so we provide this oversight. They can't consent and they can't withdraw. But we have to keep in mind that they do experience pain, they experience discomfort, distress, for the most part, just like humans do. And it's important to remember that, because if in fact they didn't do this, it's unlikely that they would be a good model system or a good surrogate for testing first in an animal before we go to human. It's because they experience these things, because their physiology is so similar to humans, that they are useful in these studies. Now, animals may be very good at hiding pain or discomfort, but they are going to experience it. And so that just provides for us then our responsibility, both in a legal sense, as we'll see, because of these regulations, these federal regulations, and also we have that moral responsibility to treat these animals as well as we can. Okay. So what has society decided? It's society that has decided that we can use animals. We are morally justified in using animals for our needs. But we have to, consider their condition, and that we must treat them humanely. So what does that mean? That means we have to consider their decent treatment, and that includes what we just talked about in terms of minimizing pain and discomfort. We have to give them adequate housing. We talk about a lifestyle, and that is that depending on the species, we need to give them, as much as we can at least, a comfortable lifestyle. If they are a social animal, we provide them with social housing. If they are animals that like to be isolated, we isolate them. We give them the kinds of foods that they need to grow and thrive. Whatever temperature requirements are, if they're an aquatic animal, what they need. We need to give them things, I like to say, things to play with. So animals need an environment that's stimulating. And so We must give them as stimulating an environment as we can. If they're used to building nests, then we give them nesting materials, things like that. So they have to have something that approximates at least uh, behaviors that they would experience if they were in a more natural environment. All right, so when we thinking about doing an animal study or approving an animal study, then there are elements that we have to consider. And what's key in this is this idea of a cost-benefit analysis. And what this says is that there must be some benefit to the study. We think, some sort of biomedical, some sort of health-related benefit, or it might be scientific knowledge that we're going to get from this study. Because this has to offset then that moral cost of using an animal. We're using an animal for our purposes. We may be causing them some kind of discomfort or stress, but we're using them. In most cases, it's going to cost them their life. So there is a moral cost. And so we have to have that cost-benefit analysis. It says the benefit that we get has to offset that moral cost. What your study is going to do with the animal, the procedures that you perform on the animal changes that moral cost. Some studies are quite simple. You may just require some tissue from an animal. Now, it's going to cost that animal its life probably, but the animal is going to, really the only thing you're going to do is you're going to house the animal appropriately and then humanely euthanize the animal and collect tissue. So the moral cost is going to be fairly low. And so we're going to match that against the benefit. But the more invasive the procedures you do, then that moral cost rises. Because your study may require that we inject the animal or we subject them to some kind of a disease process, that they require some kind of surgery, for example. So the moral cost starts going up. They may have to be in some kind of at least partial painful position. They may have an infectious disease that you're following and trying to treat. So that moral cost is going to rise. And so your benefit to offset that is also going to have to be worthwhile. And it's up to the IACUC to perform that analysis. In fact, as we'll see, it's written in law that our IACUC must perform that cost-benefit analysis. Now, how do they do that? They do that by evaluating the animal use protocol that a researcher submits. You want to do a study using animals, you're going to write up this protocol and you're just going to describe why you're doing it and how you're going to do it. What are the outcomes? What are all of the procedures that you're going to do with those animals? What are all of the things you're going to do that might be discomforting or painful? And you're going to describe all of the things that you're going to do to try to minimize that pain or discomfort. And it's the IACUC's job to collect and look at all of that information and determine or approve that study. In most cases, there's going to be recommendations that come back. The IACUC is going to say, well, you're doing these things and these things, but perhaps you could do this or this instead. And it's their job to do that. It's their job to make sure that you've considered all of the different kinds of options. And we'll come back and talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. All right, but let's talk about, where these laws come from. And the laws that we use were established almost 60 years ago now, where it was an act of Congress and they passed the Animal Welfare Act. If we go back now, I was alive back when this was passed. Most of you probably weren't, but if you go back into the mid part of the 1900s, there was a lot of animal use that was really abusive. So we had researchers that treated animals poorly. We had animal facilities that were overcrowded or dirty. Animals were made to suffer and really traumatized, not by all researchers, but by enough researchers that it became that society basically said, this, we cannot allow this. Looking here, we had primates that were abused or made to suffer without any kind of remediation, surgeries done without anesthesia or analgesia. This picture on the right is a picture of a goat that is about to be shot. So someone was going to study gunshot wounds, and their study was simply to stand that goat there and shoot it. And then they would go and examine and look at the effects of that gunshot wound. And so these kinds of studies were prevalent and relatively unregulated. Congress passed the Animal Welfare Act. And the first version of that came in 1966. And this was established the U.S. Department of Agriculture as an oversight body to oversee all of the research and training actions for warm-blooded vertebrate animals, with the exclusion of rats and mice and birds. So it excluded most of the small animals that were used in research, but included many of the large animals. So warm-blooded vertebrate, not rats or mice, but hamsters, guinea pigs, rabbits, dogs, cats, sheep, goats, all of these. All these were covered then. And it was established under the Department of Agriculture, and they formed the what's called APHIS, the Animal Plant Inspection Service, that was present. And they were the division that then implemented all of these laws that serve to regulate breeding sites or sources of animals, how they were housed at the breeding facility or on research, how they are transported between the source and the final user, the different procedures that were going to be used on animals. All of these were laid out in the Animal Welfare Act, and actually in some detail, not necessarily species by species, but saying that these had to be followed. And it was some time then before this Animal Welfare Act was amended and added to this list. Were now this was in 85, where it included all vertebrate animals, not just the warm-blooded. So now we're going to include reptiles and amphibian and fishes, and also included rats, birds, and mice. But this now added to the regulatory agencies and was put under the U.S. Public Health Service, the PHS. And this was established then under the National Institutes of Health, and they established OLAW, which is the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare. And so OLAW now has oversight of all vertebrate animals. So we see that there is some overlap between what the USDA can do, regulates, and what OLAW regulates. So when USDA looks at their regulation, they're still going to focus on these higher vertebrates, I suppose. And when NIH looks, they look at all animals. So there's some overlap. But for the most part, the kinds of regulations are very similar and are matched. So we must follow both. Now, it was established under OLAW and NIH, but most of all the other federal agencies are going to follow in suit with OLAW. And so they're going to have the same regulations. The FDA, CDC, your NSF, all of the other federal agencies are also going to follow along with and require the regulations as OLAW does. Now, in New York State, we also have an additional element, and that is we have state government and we have county that may step in and also have a set of regulations. So the Department of Health in New York State at UB, we have to get certified by USDA, we have to get approved by OLAW, and we have to get registered with the Department of Health. And so Department of Health also will come in and make sure that we're following policies. Again, mostly they follow what OLAW says, but it's New York State, and New York State sometimes, wants to have some of their own laws in place. So occasionally a Department of Health regulation may step in and make things a little more stringent. So OLAW and APHIS or USDA. So they are going to establish a set of guidelines or regulations that they lay out that we must follow. And so what they ask of us, and it's based on what the Animal Welfare Act says, is that we must have what's called an animal use program. And when that it just describes all of the ways that we're going to use animals, all of the regulations we're going to follow, how are we going to do this? And we put this together in what's called an institutional assurance. And this institutional assurance, we send to OLAW. And OLAW reads it and says they either approve it or they don't approve it. If they don't approve it, they say, well, you must also do this and you must also do that. And if you have to do it this way or that way. And these are they're just looking at the ways we are going to follow our program. They're not looking at what individual researchers are doing, but how are we going to manage our program? And so we must have that institutional assurance in place in order for us to receive any animal use grant money from actually any federal agency. And every 3 years, we get this reapproved. And we send it in and make it. And what this institutional assurance basically says is that we're going to run our program using an IACUC. And the IACUC is going to be the oversight body that is going to make sure that all of the regulations that are in place that we follow here. And they're going to manage all of the research studies that are done. They're going to approve any animal studies, and they're going to, within this institutional assurance, is going to say what the rules are that the IACUC is going to follow. How are they going to do this? What are they going to require of individuals? How is the committee going to meet? What's the committee structure going to be? How many votes do we have to do this and that? And this laid all this out. And this institutional assurance is then also going to describe all of the different elements of the LAF staff and what we're going to require for training of individuals and things like that. So it's a pretty complex or complicated document that includes all of the rules that we're going to follow. Now, this IACUC has to be set up, and it has to be set up such that it is independent of the official university administration. That is to say, decisions of the IACUC cannot be overridden by the administration. So if the IACUC decides that an animal study cannot be done, there's no one at UB that can say, yes, it can. The IACUC has final say. Now, there is an individual between the IACUC and the administration, and that is this person called the institutional official, the IO. And this is the person that is responsible for making sure that the IACUC has all of the resources that it needs to do its job. And the IO is the person that signs off on all of the agreements and the assurances that we send back to all of these agencies that says this is what we're doing. So they are considered that responsible person. They have this signatory power. They also have that responsibility or that burden of saying, yes, we are following all of these rules and we will always follow them. And if we don't follow them, it's the IO's fault. Now, the IO can override the IACUC under one kind of circumstance. And that is if the IACUC approves something, the IACUC can say, no, we're not going to do that. But they can't approve something that the IACUC has said no to. So they can make a more restrictive decision, but not a more relaxed decision. So an example of that might be if the IACUC reviewed a protocol that was going to bring, let's say they were going to bring primates to UB and do some primate studies. The university might say, wait a minute, we don't want to do primate studies at this unit. We're not going to do that. And so the IACUC can say, no, we're not going to approve that kind of study. So it may just stretch the bounds of what the university is more comfortable with. The IACUC says, yes, all the protocols in place and they're doing it and they're going to handle these animals appropriately, meet all the guidelines. But that doesn't mean that the university wants to go in that direction. So they can say no. Okay. Now, the other agency that we talked a little bit about is that ALAC, and that's that accreditation body. And this is a voluntary application that we have. And what it says, basically, they're going to come in and review everything. Everything that we do. They're going to come in and look at all of our records. They're going to read all of the minutes of our meetings, and they're going to basically, they don't call it an inspection. They call it a site visit. And they're going to come in and they're going to assess our program and determine whether we meet their standards. If there are elements that they think we need improvement on, then they will make these recommendations back, or they make a demand back and say, well, if you want to get accredited, then you must do this and this. Or they may look at some aspect of the program and say, well, you know, you're not doing this very well. And so we want you to improve that. We say it's voluntary, but it's also it's something that we pay them to do. We pay them to come in, and they're going to come in with 2 or 3 people to look through every inch of the LAF. All right. So ALAC will do that for us. All right, let's talk about the IACUC itself for just a couple of minutes and how it's structured and what its real job is. So I say the IACUC, we must have this in place, and it's these regulations state the minimum that it must be composed of. And so what they say is that we must have at least one scientist who has experience with animals. And this would be something the equivalent of a PI, someone with real experience. Hopefully we would have more than that. At UB here, we have 4 or 5 research scientists that sit on our IACUC with varied expertise. There must be a veterinarian who has some authority over the animal facility such that they can make change. So we need a clinical veterinarian. And so we have our head of LAF is our IACUC veterinarian. There must be a non-scientist on the committee. This is someone who could be from UB, perhaps from philosophy or the law school, who has some interest perhaps in animal work, but is not a scientist per se. And they may provide input into the way the IACUC is functioning or the way the program is functioning. And we also must have a person not from UB, a community person. The role of this person is, well, I think of it as kind of twofold. One is to provide a perspective from outside the university. That perspective might be for the kinds of animal work that are done in terms of how does this look to the outside, and they can provide some perspective back, and they can make perhaps some suggestions. And this also has to do with just being a representative who can sit on the committee and confirm that the committee is performing its function properly, that it is reviewing animal use protocols appropriately, that it is considering all of the different aspects, that they are monitoring the animal program appropriately, and to give the community some assurance that that UB doesn't just have oversight of itself. There must be a chair of the committee who has certain responsibility in terms of reporting and making sure that and really signing off on the actions of the committee. And there may be a number of consultants that attend any given committee meeting, and these might be they could be an outside scientist with a particular expertise. But where we more often see then is, if the study involves the use of radioactive substances, then someone from our radiation safety officer would come. We have a member who might come from environmental health and safety about biosafety. So they would participate in ways that, as part of the animal study, we might also have to consider biosafety elements or radioactive substances and how these get disposed of, or and make sure that we have the human protections in place that surround the animal study. So as I say, they're non-voting, but they provide important information and help to guide the committee in its decision-making and its recommendations. All right, so what does the IACUC do? What are its responsibilities? Well, it's one of its principal responsibilities is that it must review animal protocols for approval and any changes that occur. So every use of animals for research or teaching on campus must have an approved animal protocol, an approved IACUC protocol, before any animal can be used or for research or teaching. They also must review this institutional compliance. They have to make sure that our assurance meets policy as well. So they have to make sure that that the assurance is there and that we are following that assurance. We are complying with all of the things that we say that we must do. And so they have a responsibility for reviewing all aspects of our animal use program. Let's see, do I have another one here? So they monitor the care program, and they also must inspect the facilities. And actually, they have to inspect the facilities twice a year. The regulations are actually very specific, every 6 months or within 6 months. So they cannot wait longer than 6 months, and they must inspect every site on campus or that is under the assurance. Every site listed under the insurance, they must visit them and inspect them twice a year and file a report on that. So that's why every 6 months they're going to come around. If you're using animals, they're going to come around and look in your lab and look at the sites in your lab that you say from your approved protocol that you're doing some procedures with animals. And they go through the lab animal facilities, and they go through every room in the lab animal facilities, and they inspect them to make sure that everything is clean, that the animals are healthy, that the caging is correct. They review all of the procedures in the LAF. They review all of the veterinary notes that are taken about the care of the animals. And they review all of that material twice a year. Not the entire committee, but members of the committee will go into these different sites. At least 2 members of the committee must go on every inspection. They also have a role of following up on and considering any kind of concern that is raised. So any kind of complaint that someone might register about that they think there's something abusive has happened to an animal, or that something inappropriate, some kind of inappropriate research is being done. If that is reported in any way to the IACUC, then they must investigate that. They must consider that in some way. So that's why I think you'll see signs around all of the hallways and on the doorways that indicate if you see any issue about animal use on campus, these are the numbers to contact. And the numbers might be to contact directly to the IACUC office, or they might be, or any number of listings might be there where you can report this possible issue, and you can do it in an anonymous way. And the IACUC must look at those and consider those. They also must consider what are these issues of non-compliance. What non-compliance means is that if you have an approved animal protocol, it says how you're going to do things, then that's what you must do. You must follow your protocol. You must be compliant with it. And if you are not compliant with it, it's the job of the IACUC to investigate and determine what happened and how they're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. And so non-compliance is, sometimes there's a little bit of a gray area, but usually it is pretty cut and dry. You said you were going to give these animals some particular analgesia following that surgery, and you said you were going to give it twice a day for 3 days. If that didn't happen, that's non-compliance. If you said you were going to give the animal soft chow following this particular procedure and that didn't happen, then that's non-compliance. So it looks at, if you said you were going to do it, then it must happen. So there are things that are in the protocol that you must be compliant with, but you also must be compliant with the general rules of the animal program. Now, non-compliance doesn't necessarily mean terrible things will happen. It's the job of the IACUC to make sure that we are following all of these protocols appropriately. So if they find this that didn't happen, then they will investigate it and they will try to resolve it. And usually that means perhaps some kind of retraining of some members of that didn't understand what they were supposed to be doing. So they might have to do some retraining. They might ask the head of the lab to institute some policies to make sure that everyone knows what they're supposed to do and that they will do it properly and that they will have super oversight. This action of non-compliance is a committee decision and it becomes part of the record and it must be reported to OLAW. OLAW is not going to do anything in particular with it except make sure that the IACUC is doing its job. They want to see that the IACUC is looking, has an oversight, and that when they see non-compliance, that there is an appropriate response. That's what they're looking for. The report to OLAW doesn't really affect your NIH grant or anything like that at this point. If there is really serious non-compliance or repeated non-compliance from a lab, then it could result in a suspension. And the suspension means your protocol is now no longer approved. That does have serious repercussions, because if you do not have an approved protocol for doing that animal work, then you can't use your NIH or federal grant to pay for any animal use. And so that suspension has to be reported. And then that will be a real thing. And you will not be able to use grant money for any of your animal work until that suspension is removed. So that gets very serious. It very seldom happens because the initial non-compliance and the follow-up in the lab should be sufficient to make sure that it's not going to happen again. Okay. Now, what's not listed here, though, is something else that's important for the IACUC, and it's the idea that the IACUC has a role to support research. It doesn't sound like that from this. It sounds like they're just getting in the way. But what the IACUC is really doing is it's trying to help you get that animal protocol together properly so that you can do your research. They offer assistance. How do I want to do this I need to do this kind of procedure in my study. What's the best way to do it? how do I present that in my protocol so that it can be approved? The LAF, the lab animal facility, also has expertise. We have 3 veterinarians with various kinds of expertise with different kinds of species and different kinds of procedures. So if you're going to do something that perhaps is a little bit complicated or technical, or surgery that has some added risk, you can use the veterinarians, and they will help you to describe this procedure or to set your protocol in place so that you will be that will meet the requirements of the Animal Welfare Act and that the IACUC can approve it. So they will help you put that together, but you have to ask them for their advice. If you submit a protocol and it needs modifications, the IACUC goes to a lot of trouble to describing to you what needs to happen. It says what your protocol is missing is this. This is what you need to do. And if you follow their guidelines and make those emendations to your protocol and resubmit, then it's quite likely that it will then be approved. You can also talk to members of the IACUC committee before. You can approach them, especially if there's a member of the committee that's from your department or within your sort of research area. You can say, you could describe, I would need to do this. How do I present that to the IACUC? Or what kinds of modifications should I put in this so that the IACUC can approve it? How should I do this so that it meets all the regulations? Not how do I get around the regulations, but how do I perform this so that it meets the regulations? And so they can help you do that. The other thing that we'll do is provide training. And the LAF has a number of different training classes and courses that they offer to assist new researchers in performing different functions. Okay. All right. So what are the guidelines then, that main guidelines that the IACUC uses? And I just need to mention this idea of the 3 R's, because that's sort of the foundation for animal use and review. And the 3 R's are replacement, reduction, and refinement. What replacement refers to is you need to be sure that the animal is necessary. So you have to consider non-animal models for your work. And you will be asked to verify and provide scientific evidence that there is no non-animal model that you can use to substitute. You will have to show proof that you've done a search of the literature to try and show that that's the case. It's a requirement of the law, and the IACUC just needs to make sure that had happened. So they will ask for it. Reduction just means don't use more animals than you need. But it also says you must use enough animals to get viable data. So you don't put in too few animals that you're going to need, because then you don't have enough animals to get good data. You should just set up your study and determine how many animals you need, add enough in case a few things go wrong. And typically you might calculate how many animals you need for your study based on your statistical analysis, for example. And then you might add 10%, because every experiment doesn't work. Okay, but you don't have too many animals. You may, though, need some additional animals that your study statistics didn't require, but that you require because perhaps you have to do some training of new staff, and you need to train them in a procedure. And so you may need some animals for that training. So you want to be sure and put those in there, because you're going to use those animals for training. And so you may need a few more animals that way too. So make sure you have enough and just not too many. Just because you say that you're going to require, you're asking for some number of animals in your study, it doesn't mean you have to use every one of them. If you determine that, well, I didn't need that extra 10%, then you didn't have to purchase them and you didn't have to use them. Right? Refinement is the one, though, that really kind of it takes a lot of the consideration for these studies. And this refinement means that we want to use procedures that minimize any kind of pain or distress. And so refinement is something that can change year to year. New kinds of methodologies are developed, new techniques are developed, new procedures come into play. And so they'll ask for evidence that the procedure that you've chosen to use is really the one that will provide the least amount of pain, distress, or discomfort for the animal. If you still need to use that procedure, then you just provide a scientific justification of why you must use that one. And they will ask you, well, if you can't completely eliminate pain, then how might you minimize it? What are the other things that you might be able to do in your study to decrease the distress? Perhaps you can provide some additional soft bedding for the animal, or, we mentioned following the surgery, you might give them some soft food rather than hard chow. And so this might minimize their distress to some extent. And so they ask you to do all of the things that are possible for you to do to minimize that. And this is the veterinarians are a good resource to use. If you're going to do something that you know is going to be a major surgery or some kind of procedure that is going to cause continuing distress to the animal, you can ask the vet, for this species, what are the kinds of things that I can do to minimize it? Now, and they'll ask you again for the evidence of that search that you've done in order to try and do this. Now, this refinement also, I think it's important to think about why you want to do this. Why do you want to minimize pain and distress? Is it just to follow the regulations? One of the ways that kind of I was taught to think about animal research is that if I'm thinking about a biomedical study and I want to use an animal model and I want it to be relevant to a future human study, then what I want to do is treat that animal the same way that I would treat my human subject, because I want to be able to transfer the data that I get from that animal study to the human study. If you were doing this procedure in a human, what would you do? What would you do to minimize their pain and distress? You would probably do a number of things because you don't want them to be distressed or discomforted any more than is absolutely necessary, because you want to be able to show that your treatment or your procedure will be beneficial in some way. And the more content the individual is, the more likely a treatment will be successful. So you want to do that the same way with your animals. Treat them like a patient and do as much as you can to minimize them, to give your possible treatment or methodology a chance to work in the best way. So it's really good science to do this refinement as much as possible. And that's why we really think that using the vets to give you good advice about it and following that and teaching the individuals in your lab to do that is really the best way to do science. It may be a little more expensive, and it may cost a little bit more time, but is more likely to give you good data from your study. Okay, maybe we try a couple of those first two polling. What do you think?
Sure. I will launch the first one. Okay, it's launched. So everyone should be able to see this, which includes the work of the IACUC. A, weigh the benefits of the research against the cost to the animals. B, understand aims of the research and importance of these aims. C, consider the methods to be used and issues for the animals. D, decide whether to approve the study, and if so, whether to make suggestions for modifications. And E, all of the above.
It looks like most people did fine.
Most people chose all
If I remember, E is the correct, right?
E is the correct answer. So you have a small part amount with A, C, and D.
Yeah, right. So these are all the things that I don't think the question was saying which is the most important or anything like that. It's just these are all rules that the IACUC has.
Great. So everybody now knows it's everything. And would you like me to launch the next one?
Yeah, let's do number 2.
Great. Okay. Okay, this one says, which of the following offers a voluntary accreditation of institutional animal care and use programs? Is it A, the IRB, B, the USDA, C, OLAW, or D, the AAALAC?
Yeah, the key is voluntary because really, if we want to do animal research, we must have the approval from OLAW. And if we're going to get federal grant money, we must have that with OLAW. If we're going to do anything using USDA regulated animals, so any of those warm-blooded vertebrate animals, then we have to be certified by the USDA. And the IRB is for humans. So
the answer is the AAALAC, correct?
Yes, the ALAC is the one that's the voluntary accreditation.
Great, thank you. Do you want me to do one more, or do you want to continue?
I don't remember what the third one was.
Okay, hold on.
So maybe we'll hold off it for a second.
Sure. So it's just which of the following describes 2 major expectations upon which use of animals in research are ethically justified. So if you would like to hold off on that one, that's perfectly fine.
Oh, yeah, we can do that one. Yeah.
You want to do that one? Okay.
Sure.
Okay. So let me do that.
Well, while you're getting that ready, so one of the reasons that ALAC is kind of important is that, like I say, most major research institutions are going to be accredited by ALAC. They're going to go through that process because they want to demonstrate that their programs are top tier programs. It becomes an issue if you want to do a study that's a collaborative study. And if you want to do an animal collaborative study with another institution from UB, and your money is coming into UB, that other institution has to be ALAC accredited as well. So every dollar that you spend from your grant has to be in an ALAC approved way. That's part of the ALAC accreditation, is that if you're going to do animal research here, you have to follow their guidelines. So you can't circumvent their guidelines by having someone at another institution do it for you and give them money for it. So that does come into play sometimes. And so we want to make sure that all of our researchers have the ability to do these collaborative animal studies with other institutions.
So which of the following describes 2 major expectations upon which use of animals in research are ethically justified? A, the research findings will be meaningful and substantial animal suffering will be minimized. The animals were about to be euthanized anyway. Animals cannot be subjected to harm of any kind. That would be B. C is the research must be of benefit to animal well-being. Animals must be returned in good health at the end of the study. And D is the research must be approved by the U.S. Public Health Service, and the research must benefit human health and well-being. And I will end this one with A being the answer that is 90% people said A and 10% said D. Can you see the results?
Yep, I'm
Great.
okay. Everybody can see them, right?
Yes.
Right. So yes. So the A was those 2 elements are going to be there. meaningful of substantial, that says that there has to be a benefit.
I'm
And
gonna
then
stop.
animal suffering will be minimized. So it doesn't say that, I hate to say it this way, but it doesn't say that animals can't suffer, but whatever it is we're doing, and we have to do everything we can to minimize that.
Yes, thank you.
Now, the D, the two choices in D, now, it's not necessary for all all animal studies to benefit human health. We can do animal studies that benefit animal health. That's certainly possible. Every study with animals doesn't necessarily involve health. Sometimes it just involves understanding animal behaviors, things like that. So we have people that study birdsong. Now, birdsong doesn't have much to do with human health, but they can still be scientifically justified.
Excellent.
You might have trouble getting NIH to fund that project about birdsong,
Correct.
but NSF is a viable alternative for things that aren't directly related to human health. Sorry. Okay.
Thank you. About 23 minutes remaining.
All right. So we're going to go through this next set just kind of quick, if that's okay. Okay. So what this is a little flyer that's put out by OLA or NIH. And what it does, it just gives you an overview of the things that you will have to do and you're responsible for when you want to use animals in your project, in your NIH-funded project. And so it actually, I say it's a summary, but it has a lot of detail in. And I'm going to just kind of quickly go through some key elements to think about. And it also helps to explain, why our IACUC is going to be responsible for overseeing and making sure that we're following these kinds of regulations. All right, so let me just pop to the next page. So you can get this. This is this link here will take you, and you can download this and have your very own copy if you like. While I'm on this page, when we're thinking about putting an IACUC protocol together and submitting it, there's a very nice resource that was published. It's a few years ago now, but it gives a very nice explanation of what's going on in that animal protocol, and sort of helps you sort of understand why you're putting certain things in there, what their purpose is, and it might help you in guiding what kind of information to make sure that you get in there. And so it's a very nice resource again, and it's available at these links. Okay, so let's take a look at. Here we go. Let's take a look at a little bit of this. And so what I wanted just to emphasize here is, and we'll spend a little bit of time on this first one, because this is basically, it's saying what the PHS policy is in terms of animal use. And there's this official US government principles list of the principles of animal use. I think that's where we want to be with this one. Let's just go to those. It says first that it's based on the Animal Welfare Act. So we're going to follow all the regulations that are laid out that it says we must cover from those two sets of Animal Welfare Act in terms of how we're going to transport, care, and use animals. Okay. It says that we must have relevance. Here's the human or animal health or advancement of knowledge, something for the good of society. There's that idea of the benefit that has to be there. And so you have to include that in your protocol. You're going to explain why this is important, what makes it relevant, that it has some benefit. And you're going to justify that as much as possible. It's going to look perhaps a lot like you're going to put this into your animal protocol as well as in your grant. It says that you must be using the appropriate species of animal and the numbers. So you should have to take some care in choosing what is the best species for me to do this study, the most representative. Okay, here we go. It says that, we have to minimize discomfort, distress, and pain. So the Public Health Service, guidelines are telling you that you have to do that. So you have to include that, what you did to minimize that. It says that you, let's see, including avoidance or minimization. Here's another one that says that if there's going to be any kind of pain or distress, you should perform them with the appropriate kind of sedation or analgesia or anesthesia. That's appropriate for that species and for that procedure. I underline should be, because when we look at the regulations, many times they will not be completely restrictive. So they should be performed with analgesia, but it doesn't say they must be performed with analgesia. So it gives you the opportunity to modify or defend or provide evidence that, well, I can't use analgesia for my study because, and you'll provide some scientific justification. And now you don't have to. That scientific justification should specify why for your study, you can't use an opiate because it will interfere with a brain pathway, and that's what you're studying. And you'll provide some literature references to back that up. You can't use an anesthesia because general anesthesia will do something, again, perhaps to the brain of the animal, that will make such that my study won't be valid anymore. And so you will provide that evidence for that. So it gives you that opportunity to do that. If you can't provide that evidence, then you will perform these things. Okay. The number 6 here says that if you're doing a study and you're causing some kind of trauma or injury or disease or to the animal, that you have to have some kind of an endpoint that's appropriate. So you have to define where that humane endpoint is. If it's a lethal procedure, perhaps an infection that will result in death, you can't take the animal to death. You have to take the animal only as far as is necessary to get your data, and then you have to euthanize the animal in the appropriate way. Okay. Again, there's a should be. So if you can provide scientific evidence that something is necessary, then it gives you the opportunity to do that. But the bar gets raised higher and higher, the more trauma that you want to cause to that animal. Okay, number 7 is pretty obvious. Basically, this is what the lab animal facility is going to do. They're going to provide the appropriate housing for different species of animals for you. And unless you're asking for something else to happen, then they're going to do that. You might occasionally ask that a normally social animal be housed individually. And in that case, you're going to have to, again, you have to justify that. Why does that animal have to be housed individually rather than in a cohort of other animals? Because if it's a social animal, then they get stressed when they are alone. Here's one, 8, investigators shall be appropriately qualified and experienced. So shall be is different than should be. Shall be says you will do this. And what it says is, we don't offer an exception to this. If you have individuals that are going to perform procedures on animals, they have to be trained and know what they're doing. And they will ask that training be documented. And so part of that animal protocol that you put together is going to describe the training that the individuals have already had. What the IACUC may do is look at that training and say, well, but you also have individuals that are going to perform surgeries, and perhaps they will have to undergo additional training in the surgical class that the LAF offers, for example, something like that. That the training and qualifications have to be described in the protocol, or you're going to describe how individuals will get that training. It might be from an LAF class, or it might be from the PI. The PI may be saying that I will provide this training to all the individuals, and I will document that training and submit that to the IACUC in lieu of the training that the LAF would offer. Anytime there's an exception to these requirements or should be's or shall be's, then those must be documented in some way. So every exception must be documented. And there's a specific place in our protocols that you can list the exception, and you can provide the scientific justification of why you must deviate from what the Animal Welfare Act or the PHS guidelines are telling you must do. And it's up to the IACUC to consider those exceptions and see if they and determine if they are adequate or not adequate. And they may or may not give you feedback to say what you might have to do in addition. Okay. So I just wanted to go through that. This is a link to what's called the guide. And what the guide does is it provides basically an interpretation of all of those Animal Welfare Act regulations and the PHS regulations. It gives you an interpretation of them and tells you how they might be applied. It's not something that a researcher would necessarily need to use, but it's what the IACUC uses when they come across something and they want to know how to put your protocol in alignment with the regulations, how to interpret those regulations. So the IACUC will use it. And again, it's free. You can get a digital copy of this from this link it might become of interest if you were going to, if you wanted to dispute a recommendation or decision by the IACUC. You might go to the guide and say, well, the guide sort of does this. Couldn't it be interpreted this way? And if you believe that the way you're going to do it is the only way that you can perform your study. Yeah, we don't have to go through all of these. The guide still uses those kinds of terms that sometimes it'll indicate that something must be done, and then there's very little wiggle room, or should be done, and then that's a recommendation that the IACUC is saying, well, you should do this, but if you're not going to do that, you should sort of explain to us why you're not going to do that. And then mays are just things that, well, you could consider this or this. It might be something else you could consider doing instead of the way you're doing it. Okay, it just provides some of these kinds of approaches. All right. Who has to comply to these? Well, I think as we mentioned, if you want to get federal funding, then you have to comply with these PHS policies. And no matter what federal agency you're going to get money from, they're all going to require that if you're going to do animal work, then you have to follow these policies. Here at UB, we treat all of our studies in the same way. So no matter where you get your grant money from, all of the animal studies are reviewed in the same way. So we don't really distinguish between one funding agency and the other. Even if you're going to do your study from internal or department funds, your animal work is going to be evaluated in the same way. What is an IACUC? We don't need to go with that. We've already covered that. Your job is going to be basically, to describe within your grant application. Then, I'm sorry. This statement is basically saying that if you're going to use animals, then you must have IACUC approval. In most cases, you must have IACUC approval before you even accept the grant. You don't have to have it necessarily when you submit it, but you have to have it before you can accept it. And you absolutely have to have IACUC approval before you can spend any dollars on an animal-related work. You can't buy an animal using funds until you have IACUC approval in place. In most cases, they won't even activate the grant until your IACUC approval is in place. Okay, and so you must keep your protocol active and approved. So even though your grant may go for 5 years, your protocol only goes for 3 years. So you have to make sure that you keep it in an approved state and make sure that it's renewed and still active.
Is this anything like the IRB where if you have to make a significant change, you can go back to the IACUC for approval of the change?
Well, if there's a, yes, if you're going to make if you want to make a change, what this is saying is about kind of about the grant.
Okay.
So if you're going to make a change in the way you're going to do your animal work, if it's a significant change, you may need to go back to your granting agency and say, we're going to make this change. At the IACUC level or the protocol level at UB, you cannot make any change in your animal protocol without approval. You must follow what your protocol says. You don't have any other options. And
Right,
what
so if
this
there's a
says is that NIH might also need to know if it's a significant change. But that's kind of your responsibility and not IACUC's responsibility.
Correct, and if it's a minor change, you can go to IACUC for that, for the approval, or is there not normally a lot of changes in animal?
For your animal protocol that is approved, any change is considered, it must be approved.
Okay, yep, that's what I thought. Just like with the IRB. Thank you.
So actually, while we're on that little topic, one of the strategies you should consider in putting your animal protocol together is to try and be flexible. Try to give yourself options whenever possible so that you're not locked into doing something one specific way, and then you find that you need to make some small change. Unfortunately, there are all kinds of little details that you might have. You might say that you're going to use a 26 gauge needle that's a 1/2 inch long to do this injection. You go to do your procedure and you don't have those. You have a 27 gauge needle, but you wrote in your protocol that you were going to use 26. And unfortunately, you're stuck. So try to be flexible. Say, I'm going to use a 25 to 27 gauge needle of this varied length. Any of those would be appropriate and could be approvable. So give yourself as wide a latitude as possible.
Great. So just like with the IRP, don't write a too narrow protocol because then you're going to be stuck.
Right. Because you might think that, well, if I specify this, then I'm more likely to get approved. But it might you don't know when you're going to have an issue later, and to provide yourself with some latitude. As long as it's, any of those would work, include all of them that you can.
Excellent. Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. So if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat and feel free to go on. I don't see any chat questions yet.
Okay. Let's, I think we've talked about these aspects of things to include when you're talking about, so I don't need to review those again here. So this says what you're gonna, so for your IACUC approval, and it's important that what you say in your IACUC protocol matches up with what your grant says you're gonna do. Now, again, these are just the aspects that you have to be sure and include, but it's this next slide that's the one that's kind of critical. And especially for an NIH grant, at some point, there's going to be what's called a congruency check. And that congruency check is going to be, there's going to be an individual from the IACUC that looks at your grant application and all of the animal studies that you say you're going to do in there, and they match it up with your approved animal protocol. Everything you say in the grant that you got money for must be included in your animal protocol. You can have additional things in your animal protocol. It's fine. You can have your animal protocol cover 2 grants, but everything in that grant, you must have approval to do in your protocol. So you have to make sure that it's in there. And that's why in that grant, don't be more specific than you have to. You have to justify it for the granting agency, but don't lock yourself up too much. And then make sure that the way you described it in your animal protocol allows you to do everything that you said you were going to get money for. Okay. All right, that's just that link to that other aspect. And post-award just says that the IACUC is responsible for follow-up as well. And remember that your IACUC approval is 3 years, and your grants may be longer there, and your grant may overlap at different times. So you have to make sure that your IACUC approval stays in place until the end of your award. That's basically what I had. I put these scenarios at the end, but I never have time to go through them because we always just barely finish in time. Do we have that one more question?
We do have one more question. You want to do one more?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
Okay.
We got a couple minutes.
Let's do the last poll. Okay, in which of the following circumstances may animal work begin at the institution before receipts of IACUC approval? A, it is an expired study awaiting continuing 3-year renewal and for which the renewal protocol has been submitted to the IACUC. B, it is a small pilot study on non-USDA regulated species. C, it is a teaching activity that uses personally owned dogs and cats. And D, there are no circumstances in which animal work using regulated species may begin before IACUC approval.
Okay, so the way this is worded, you must have IACUC approval. You can't do any animal work on a vertebrate species without prior IACUC approval. Somebody thought USDA. Well, remember USDA only talks about warm-blooded animals, so no, all vertebrate. So no matter size of the pilot, doesn't matter if you brought your own animals in. If you're going to do something teaching or research-wise, they're also covered. If you want to have your dog sit in your office with you and you want to play with it, you don't have to have approval for that. You can have a fish tank in your office as long as you're not using it to teach or do research. And so animals can be on campus, but if you're going to do anything research and teaching wise, that has to be approved. An expired study is an expired study. If you didn't renew in time and your 3-year study is over, you're done. You cannot use any animals until it's approved. Your animals will be taken from you and they will be kept in the LAF, but you can't do anything more with them. You can't continue you can't do any more procedures with them. And you cannot, if you have an NIH grant, you cannot pay from that grant to keep those animals because you can only use your grant money on your approved animal use. And so once they are taken from you and put in return to under an LAF protocol, they're not yours anymore, and you'll have to pay for them in some other way. LAF is going to charge you, but you're going to have to find some other way to pay for them.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Appreciate all this. Does anyone have any questions?